In this resource, I'm going to walk you through how I organize my CSS as a model for how you might organize yours this week. This is all pretty new, so just try it out, experiment, and take what you can from it. The goal is to prevent the conflicts we covered in the Cascade video. And on this page, I've broken my CSS into separate files. Each one represents one section of the Cascade structure. You'll see all those sections in this Activity 2 resource. To prevent CSS problems, you only need to follow a couple of rules and stick to them religiously. Rule number 1 is keep all CSS in external files. Even if you have several files, that's fine. Just don't put styles in the head under a style tag and don't use them in line with the HTML elements. Following this rule alone will remove a huge amount of problems automatically. Rule number 2. The order you include your CSS files matter. You need to load them from least specific to most specific. If you organize your files, or a single style sheet, in this order and you stick to the purpose of each section, you'll avoid the rest of the problems and conflicts that happen. Problems happen when CSS gets scattered, when you have selectors with different specificity all over the place, or mixing tags, files, classes, IDs, element selectors, and a combination of all those together. The more specific a selector it is, the higher their priority. When your CSS lives in many places with different selector types, that's when the cascade turns into a fight. By defining the least specific styles at the top and gradually moving towards more specific ones, you ride the cascade instead of fighting it. Start broad, let inheritance work for you, and then only narrow things down when you need to, usually at the bottom in page-specific CSS. The order I use is variables, reset, then base elements and styles, and then layout, components, page-specific, then utilities, and finally media queries. I don't have much of a site here yet, so I'm not showing off the HTML side by side. I just want to show you the CSS structure. So let's start with the variables file, since that's at the very top. Inside the CSS folder, I've got a variables.css file, which I include globally. I've referenced it using an absolute path. In this file, I define things like the color theme using meaningful names, not like color 1 or color 2, but colors I actually use while coding. Then I define my base fonts or body and headings. I set font sizes, spacing variables, and some layout related variables, and finally breakpoints as variables as well. The spacing variables use a universal naming convention, so I don't have to think about individual margins or paddings. I'm using the medium spacing by default. That way, if I want to change the default, I just change the medium spacing. The layout variables let me store values I know I'll reuse, and the breakpoints being variables means all my media queries, regardless of how many I have, stay consistent even across multiple files. You don't need all these, it's just an example of what I'm using. Next comes the reset. The reset is small, but the explanation really matters a lot here. Browsers handle margin, padding, and box sizing differently. The reset levels everything, so browsers behave the same. The wildcard selector removes margin and padding and forces box sizing to be border box. And I only use the wildcard here because it makes the browser touch every element, and I don't want the performance to hit elsewhere. The downside of resetting everything is that you do remove useful defaults, especially for things like lists. This is where the next section, base CSS, comes in. Base CSS only uses HTML element selectors. For example, I set a global font and font size on the HTML tag itself. And then I set a body text and color and backgrounds using variables on the body tag itself. And then universal settings for headings and font families. Next, I adjust each heading size and line height individually. Smaller headings get more line height so they stay readable. And then I define default element behaviors. For instance, making images perform at a block level, using the anchors with an underline so the links are obvious, making sure form elements have margin at the bottom, making sure form inputs inherit the base font of the document, setting field set and legend to get basic spacing so forms don't look weird or old-fashioned. Then I create attribute selectors that do not include radios and checkboxes to style all text-based inputs and selects to be full width with padding. And this is the place to define universal form behavior. I also set global defaults and buttons here with a warning that anything in the base section affects every button on the whole site, and this is the case with all these tags. You should only put properties here that you want globally. The cursor, maybe padding, maybe border radius, I don't know. Do you want every button to look that way? The same with paragraphs and lists. Since we removed their default margins, we have to manually add them back. Things like UL and OL and P all get spacing reintroduced so the page doesn't collapse visually. I also keep this entire base section minimal because the selectors have the lowest specificity, which is exactly what we want for global defaults. One trick I use while developing is to create a quick test page full of example elements, forms, buttons, headings, sections, etc. This helps visualize early on whether the base layer is working before I actually build the real pages or not. Once base is handled, I move on to layout. I haven't built most of my layout yet, so the site is still being developed. But layout is where your header grid, your footer grid, navigation, flex layout, wrappers, and containers are going to live. Not content grids, things like card grids. Those are more of components or page-specific sections, which we'll talk about in a minute. Layout is the structure of the site itself. Try to put layout properties here and nowhere else unless something absolutely requires a component level override at a lower level. Unless something absolutely requires a component level override at a lower, more specific level. After layout comes my components. A component is anything that I want to be reusable and self-contained, like a button or a card, a navigation bar, form blocks. I already defined universal button behavior in the base section, but the components section I define how buttons look. For example, the button class sets padding, border radius, background color, etc. The base button styles give buttons default behavior. The component styles define the appearance. Here's a great example of where a conflict can happen. If I style the padding in both the base and the component section, there is the conflict. So right now I have to decide, do I want to put padding in a universal setting for all buttons, or do I want padding to only be this way for this particular style of button? The same with borders, colors, and hover states. Functionality goes in the base, appearance goes in the component. This is where I'm going to start using a term called BEM for block, element, and modifier style naming. In this case, button is a component. In this case, button is an element. It's an element because it's just one single thing. There's not other elements inside of it. And button dash dash disabled is the modifier. This lets me stack the styles down the cascade intentionally. Let me explain. The base button first inherits the button element selectors. So we have just the button CSS coming through that makes the cursor into the pointer. Then the class BTN is applied. This controls all the visual layout, the rounded corners, the colors, the borders, and things like that. Then we just add a button disabled class, and that just overrides the part of the button that we want to look different, and that's all. We don't have to redefine everything about the button again. We can just modify it. In this case, we've not only prevented errors, but we're now starting to use the cascade to help us keep things simpler. Let's take something more complicated like a navigation bar and use our BEM keywords here to help us understand it a little bit better. In this case, the navigation bar is a block because it has elements inside of it. And so the way we refer to this is not by relying on tag selectors like nav, ul, li, and a to select an individual link. Instead, use classes like nav primary for the block. And then for the elements, you can use nav primary double underscore and then list item and link. All class selectors have the same specificity, so nothing fights in this model. The modifier nav primary link dash dash active handles the selected page highlight. This approach not only avoids special problems, it also frees you up from your HTML structure. You can now change the H1 to an H2, for instance, or reorganize the markup without having to rewrite all your CSS rules to match. This exact thinking can be applied to something like a product card. Think of a product card. Is a product card a block or an element? In this case, I would call it a block because the product card is the block itself. But the block is going to have elements in it like an image, text, price, button. I can even add modifiers to the card. Like I can make this a featured card if there's a bunch of cards and I want this one to stand out more like it's on sale. Or I can change the button. to maybe change the background color based on if it's a buy button or a get more information button. All of this stays in the component section because it's reusable, and I only have to define it once and I get all this control. The next few sections will vary on what you have for your site, but after components comes the page-specific CSS. This is the CSS that only applies to one page, like the hero on the home page or a special layout on the category page. You can prefix the classes with the page name. That helps a lot, so that way they don't conflict with anything global. If your product grid is used elsewhere, it's a component. If it's unique to one page, it goes here, and that determines how you use it. For instance, if you're going to have the product grid on a bunch of pages, maybe you want that to become a component. But if you're only going to use it on the category page, maybe you want to keep it in the page-specific section. Some of these decisions seem more complicated than they really are, so just focus on keeping it simple for now and just making sure that you define things in the height of the file that you're thinking. If you find yourself reusing a section more than once, try to move it up higher in the file so it can apply to more things at the same time. And that's why I turn this into a component if I wanted to use it in many places versus leaving it way down at the bottom in the page-specific section. Another thought to consider is that you can break out individual files at this point if you want to. You can make a forms CSS, a navigation CSS, etc. Just remember that the order matters. So include them just like you would as if they were one file. That's the order you have to follow. Keep them stacked in the same cascade order. Variables, reset, base, layout, components, pages, utilities, and media queries. I also keep a page for utilities. We've been over these before, so I won't cover them at great length, but they are tiny single property helpers like text center or margin top is small or padding is large. These are optional, but I use them when I want a quick one-off adjustment without having to create a whole new component just to change something simple. And finally, I have 3 media queries: small, medium, and large. I use variables for the breakpoints so the values stay consistent across all files. Inside each media query, I follow the exact same cascade structure, layout, components, page specific, and so on, and that keeps the responsive behavior predictable as well. That just about wraps things up. This was a lot of information this week, but the concept should start making sense now that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are all working together in your project. Practice these ideas this week. Keep all your CSS external. Use clear, unique class names for components and page sections. Define the most global styles at the top, and only narrow your selectors as you move down the cascade and only as needed. Most importantly, don't just throw something in. If you need to experiment, that's fine, but you got to go back and clean up that afterwards in order to put it where it belongs so it doesn't create conflicts later on. These conflicts happen in every project if the CSS isn't organized correctly. Learning this now will save you weeks of frustration going forward, obviously when your projects start getting larger. Use this week's discussion to ask questions about this process, talk among each other, and let's figure it out. Post your code, share a file, ask for advice if you need. The goal here is not to learn this in this one video and understand it so well that you can program it from scratch. The goal here is to understand why your CSS breaks, and I want to see some sort of effort or action in your final site that shows me you're trying to prevent that from happening. For those of us that borrow from other places, including AI, you might be finding that AI doesn't think like this. So you're going to have to think through this yourself and organize it this way. Your goal this week, again, is to demonstrate some of this understanding as you create the header, footer, and navigation system for your final site this week. Let's get those templates set up and be ready to add the content and finishing touches next week. Happy coding and have a great week.